The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton's training grounds as Lieutenant Claire Bennett stepped off the transport vehicle. At 32 years old, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform pressed to perfection. She had spent 8 years in military intelligence, earning commendations for her work overseas. But none of that seemed to matter here. Another desk officer trying to play soldier. She heard someone mutter as she walked past a group of Marines gathered near the obstacle course. Claire kept her eyes forward. She had requested this transfer to combat training instruction after years behind a computer screen. She wanted to prove to herself that she could do more than analyze data and write reports. She wanted to teach, to mentor, to be in the field where the real work happened. Staff Sergeant Danny Ortega was her assigned training supervisor. He was a barrel-chested man in his early 40s, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that had seen too many deployments. When she reported to his office, he barely looked up from his paperwork. "Lieutenant Bennett," he said, his tone flat. "I'll be honest with you. I didn't ask for you, and I don't need you. We've got enough instructors here who actually know what they're doing." Claire stood at attention. "With respect, Staff Sergeant, I'm here to learn and contribute. I may come from intelligence, but I'm a Marine first." Ortega finally looked at her, his expression somewhere between annoyance and pity. "Intelligence, right. You analyze spreadsheets while we train warriors. This isn't a classroom, Lieutenant. This is where we make fighters." "I understand that, Staff Sergeant. Do you?" He stood up, walking around his desk. "Have you ever been in hand-to-hand combat? Real combat, not some self-defense course at headquarters?" Claire met his gaze. "I completed advanced combatives training at Quantico. I've maintained my Quantico." Ortega shook his head. "That's like learning to swim in a bathtub and thinking you're ready for the ocean. Look, I'll assign you to assist with administrative duties. You can observe the training sessions, take notes, whatever intelligence officers do. But stay out of the way of my instructors." The dismissal stung, but Claire kept her face neutral. "I'm qualified to instruct, Staff Sergeant. My orders. Your orders say you're assigned here for cross-training. They don't say I have to put you in front of my Marines. These men and women are preparing for deployment. Their lives depend on the quality of training they receive. I'm not going to let some paper pusher with good intentions compromise that." Over the next 2 weeks, Claire existed on the margins of the training program. She organized schedules, filed reports, and watched from the sidelines as other instructors ran the Marines through grueling exercises. The mockery was constant, though rarely direct enough to warrant official complaint. "Hey, Lieutenant, need help carrying that clipboard?" a corporal asked one morning, his friend snickering behind him. "Lieutenant Bennett, maybe you should analyze the statistical probability of completing this obstacle course," another Marine called out during a training session. Even the other instructors treated her like an outsider. They would stop talking when she approached or speak over her suggestions during planning meetings. One evening, she overheard 2 of them at the mess hall. "I don't know why they keep sending us these headquarters types," one said. "She probably hasn't run a mile in years. Ortega should just send her back. She's taking up space we could use for someone who actually belongs here." Claire ate her dinner alone that night, each bite tasting like ashes. She had faced challenges before, had worked twice as hard to prove herself in intelligence circles dominated by men who assumed she couldn't handle the pressure. But this felt different. These were her fellow Marines, people who were supposed to be her brothers and sisters in arms. And they had decided she wasn't worth their respect before she'd even had a chance to try. That night, in her small quarters, Claire stood in front of the mirror in her PT gear. Her body was lean and strong from years of maintaining her fitness standards, even behind a desk. She had trained in martial arts since childhood, had competed in amateur mixed martial arts before joining the Marines. She wasn't some fragile analyst who couldn't handle physical work, but none of that mattered if no one would give her a chance to show it. She thought about requesting a transfer back to intelligence. It would be easy to tell herself that she had tried, but the culture here was too toxic, that she was wasting her time. But something deeper kept her rooted in place. She had come here with a purpose, and she wasn't ready to abandon it just because the path was harder than she'd expected. The breaking point came on a humid Tuesday morning during a demonstration on close-quarters combat. Staff Sergeant Ortega was walking the Marines through defensive techniques against larger opponents. Claire stood at the back of the group, taking notes as she'd been instructed, trying to ignore the weight of being invisible. "The key is using your opponent's strength against them," Ortega was saying. "Size doesn't matter if you know the right techniques." But he paused, and Claire saw something shift in his expression. Technique only works if you've got the guts to use it under pressure. Some people look good in a controlled environment, but fold when things get real. His eyes flicked toward Claire for just a moment, but it was enough. Several Marines turned to look at her, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks. Staff Sergeant, one of the senior Marines, Corporal Rick Hayes, spoke up. He was a thick-necked man with arms like tree trunks and a reputation for being the toughest fighter in the unit. "What about Lieutenant Bennett? She's supposed to be an instructor, right? Maybe she could demonstrate some of these intelligence officer techniques." Laughter rippled through the group. Ortega held up a hand for quiet, but Claire could see the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Lieutenant Bennett is here in an observational capacity," Ortega said. "She's not. I'll demonstrate." Claire's voice cut through the morning air, clear and steady. The laughter died. Everyone turned to stare at her. Ortega frowned. "Lieutenant, that's not necessary. These men need to. You said technique works regardless of size," Claire said, stepping forward through the crowd of Marines. "I'd like to demonstrate that principle, if the staff sergeant permits." The challenge hung in the air. Ortega couldn't back down now without looking like he was protecting her, which would only make things worse. He nodded slowly. "All right, Lieutenant." Corporal Hayes, front and center. Hayes grinned as he stepped forward. He had at least 80 pounds on Claire and a 6-inch height advantage. "Don't worry, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "I'll go easy on you. Don't." Claire's voice was cold now, something shifting in her demeanor. She rolled her shoulders, loosening up. "Treat me like any other opponent." Ortega explained the drill. "This is about defending against an aggressive advance. Hayes, you're going to come at the lieutenant with a standard attack pattern. Lieutenant, your job is to neutralize the threat. Everyone else, watch the technique." Claire and Hayes faced each other on the mat. She could see the confidence in his eyes, the certainty that this would be over in seconds. He probably thought he'd have to hold back to avoid hurting her. The other Marines watched with a mixture of anticipation and second-hand embarrassment, expecting to witness her humiliation. "Begin," Ortega called. Hayes moved forward, fast for a big man. He threw a wide right hook, telegraphing it just enough to show he was still holding back despite her words. Claire didn't retreat. She stepped inside his reach, redirecting his arm with her left hand while her right palm struck upward into his solar plexus. The hit was controlled, but solid. Hayes stumbled back, surprised. The smile had left his face. "Again," Claire said. This time Hayes came at her seriously. He threw a combination jab, cross, low kick. But Claire moved like water, deflecting and redirecting each strike. When he overextended on the kick, she swept his planted leg and used his own momentum to take him down. He hit the mat hard, and before he could recover, she had transitioned to a controlling position, her knee against his shoulder. His arm locked at an angle that would cause serious pain if she applied pressure. She held the position for 3 seconds. then released him and stood up, offering her hand. Hayes took it, his face red, but whether from exertion or embarrassment, Claire couldn't tell. "That was one," she said quietly. "Who's next?" The silence that followed was profound. Then Corporal Lisa Martinez stepped forward. She was a skilled fighter with a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and a reputation for never backing down. "I'll go, Lieutenant." Martinez was more technical than Hayes, using better footwork and tighter combinations. But Claire had spent years training with some of the best martial artists in the military. She read Martinez's patterns, waited for the opening. And when Martinez threw a high kick, Claire caught her leg, swept the other, and controlled her descent to the mat. 2 down. Private First Class Jordan Mitchell went next, then Corporal Sam Torres. Both were solid fighters. Both ended up on the mat within seconds of engaging her. Claire wasn't brutal about it. These were training exercises. Not real fights, but she was efficient, precise, and utterly calm throughout each engagement. When Torres stood up, brushing off his uniform, the entire training ground had gone quiet. Claire stood in the center of the mat, barely winded, and looked directly at Staff Sergeant Ortega. 4 Marines, she said. Seconds each. Would the Staff Sergeant like to continue the demonstration? The atmosphere at Camp Pendleton shifted after that morning, but not in the way Claire had hoped. Instead of respect, she faced something worse: resentment mixed with grudging acknowledgement. The Marines who had been dropped stopped making jokes, but their silence was cold, laden with injured pride. The others watched her with a new wariness, but kept their distance. Staff Sergeant Ortega called her into his office that afternoon. He didn't ask her to sit. "That was quite a show, Lieutenant," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "It wasn't a show, Staff Sergeant. It was a demonstration of the techniques you were teaching. I thought that was the point." "The point," Ortega said, leaning back in his chair, "is to train these Marines for combat, not to embarrass them in front of their peers." Claire felt anger flare in her chest, but kept her voice level. "With respect, they've been embarrassing me for 2 weeks. Every joke, every dismissive comment, every time they treated me like I didn't belong here. That was embarrassing. But I didn't complain. I waited for an opportunity to show what I could do. And now you've made enemies. I made enemies the day I arrived because I came from intelligence. Nothing I did or didn't do would have changed that." Ortega studied her for a long moment. "You're right," he finally said. "You're right, and I was part of the problem. I judged you before you walked through the door. I assumed you couldn't handle this environment, and I let my instructors treat you accordingly." The admission surprised Claire. She had expected another lecture, another veiled threat to send her back to headquarters. "But here's what you need to understand," Ortega continued. "These Marines, Hayes, Martinez, the others, they're not bad people. They're scared. They're heading to Afghanistan in 3 months, and they're looking at their instructors to prepare them for the worst day of their lives. When headquarters sends someone they perceive as weak or unqualified, it feels like the Corps doesn't take their survival seriously. So I have to prove myself twice as hard because I came from intelligence. You have to prove yourself twice as hard because that's what leaders do." Ortega stood up. "Starting tomorrow, you'll co-instruct the advanced hand-to-hand combat sessions. You've earned that. But earning their respect? That's going to take more than dropping people on a mat." Over the next 3 weeks, Claire threw herself into teaching. She arrived before dawn and stayed late, developing lesson plans, reviewing footage of training sessions, working with individual Marines who struggled with specific techniques. She was patient, thorough, and never once used her skill to humiliate anyone. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, things began to change. Corporal Martinez approached her one evening after a particularly difficult session on ground fighting. "Lieutenant, can I ask you something?" Martinez said, her voice hesitant. Of course. That reversal you did against Hayes, the one where you stepped inside his hook. I've tried it 3 times in sparring and keep getting caught. What am I missing? Claire walked her through it, demonstrating the footwork, explaining the timing. Martinez practiced it slowly, then faster, until the movement clicked. Her face lit up with understanding. That makes sense now. Thank you, ma'am. It was a small moment, but it mattered. A few days later, Private Mitchell asked for help with his grappling technique. Then Torres wanted to learn the sweep she'd used on him. One by one, the Marines who had mocked her began to see her not as an outsider trying to prove something, but as someone who genuinely wanted to help them survive. But not everyone came around. Corporal Hayes remained distant, his pride still wounded. And there were others, particularly among the senior enlisted, who resented that an officer, especially a female officer from intelligence, had shown them up that the real test came during a field exercise in the 4th week. The scenario was a simulated patrol in hostile territory, with instructors playing the role of enemy combatants. Claire was assigned to lead a squad through a mock village, assess threats, and complete objectives under pressure. Her squad included Hayes, Martinez, Mitchell, and 2 other Marines who had been vocal critics. As they moved through the exercise, Claire coordinated their movements, calling out threats, adjusting tactics on the fly. She used her intelligence background to analyze the scenario, spotting ambush points and reading the instructors' likely strategies. They completed the exercise faster than any squad that week. With no casualties dot when they regrouped at the debriefing point, Hayes finally spoke to her directly. That was good tactics, Lieutenant. You saw that flanking position before any of us. Intelligence training, Claire said with a slight smile. Turns out it's useful for more than pushing papers. Hayes nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess it is. That night, several of the Marines invited her to join them at the informal gathering they held on Friday evenings. Nothing official. Just food and conversation away from the structure of base life. Claire accepted, and for the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton, she felt like she might actually belong. But the feeling was fragile, built on uncertain ground. And in the back of her mind, Claire knew that true acceptance would require more than competence. It would require her to face a challenge that would test not just her skills, but her character. The challenge came from an unexpected direction. Captain Vincent Brennan arrived at Camp Pendleton on a Friday afternoon in the 5th week of Claire's assignment. He was a decorated combat officer with 3 tours under his belt and a reputation for producing the toughest, most effective Marines in the course. He was also Claire's former commanding officer from her time in intelligence, and the reason she had requested this transfer. When she saw him step out of the staff car, Claire felt her stomach drop. Brennan had opposed her transfer from the beginning. He had told her she was wasting her talents, that she was too valuable in intelligence to risk on a misguided attempt to prove something. He had made it clear that he saw her request as a personal betrayal, a rejection of everything he had taught her. She hadn't seen him in 4 months. She had hoped it would be longer. That evening, Brennan joined the instructors' meeting. He sat at the head of the table, his presence dominating the room. Ortega introduced him as an observer who would be evaluating the training program's effectiveness. I've heard interesting things about the developments here, Brennan said, his eyes finding Claire, particularly about Lieutenant Bennett's unconventional approach to instruction. The words were carefully chosen, just ambiguous enough to sound neutral while carrying an undercurrent of criticism. Lieutenant Bennett has been an asset to the program, Ortega said. Her contributions have been valuable. I'm sure they have. Brennan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. In fact, I'd like to see a demonstration tomorrow. A full combat scenario, instructors versus trainees. Let's see how practical these new teaching methods really are. The room went tense. Full combat scenarios were intensive exercises reserved for the final weeks of training. They were designed to push everyone to their limits, to simulate the chaos and pressure of real warfare. Running one now, with Brennan watching, felt like a setup. Claire met Brennan's eyes and understood. He was going to prove she didn't belong here. He was going to demonstrate that her place was back in intelligence, behind a desk where she couldn't get herself or anyone else hurt. The scenario began at dawn. Claire led a team of 6 Marines, including Hayes, Martinez, and Mitchell, against an instructor team that included Brennan himself. The objective was simple: extract a high-value target from a fortified position while under fire from multiple directions. It was brutal from the start. The instructor team used every advantage, every trick learned from actual combat. They flanked, they coordinated, they exploited every mistake. Within the first 10 minutes, 2 of Claire's Marines were marked as casualties. But Claire had studied Brennan's tactics for 3 years. She knew how he thought, how he fought. She adjusted her strategy, using unconventional approaches that threw off the instructor's timing. When they expected her to retreat, she pushed forward. When they anticipated an assault, she melted back into cover. Halfway through the scenario, she found herself face to face with Brennan in a narrow corridor of the mock building. He was supposed to be simulating an enemy commander. In the exercise, she could have called him out as a casualty with a well-placed, simulated shot. Instead, he spoke, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "This is pointless, Claire. You're playing soldier while people who actually understand warfare do the real work. Come back to intelligence. Stop wasting everyone's time." Claire stared at him, understanding flooding through her. This wasn't about tactics or training. This was personal. Brennan had built his career on the belief that intelligence officers were the architects of victory, that field combat was for people who couldn't handle the complexity of strategic thinking. Her transfer challenged that worldview. It suggested that intelligence officers could be warriors too, that his way wasn't the only way. "With respect, sir," Claire said, "I'm exactly where I need to be." She moved past him, continuing the exercise. Her team completed the objective with 3 Marines still active. A respectable showing against a more experienced instructor team. But when the after-action review began, Brennan tore apart every decision she'd made. He questioned her judgment, her tactics, her leadership. He was professional enough not to be overtly cruel, but every word was designed to undermine her credibility in front of the Marines she'd worked so hard to earn respect from. The lieutenant showed initiative, Brennan concluded. But initiative without proper training and experience is just recklessness. These Marines deserve instructors who have actually been tested in combat, not someone playing out a fantasy. Claire felt the room shift. The fragile trust she'd built began to crack. She saw doubt creeping back into the faces of the Marines who had started to believe in her. That night, alone in her quarters, Claire broke. The tears came hard and fast, months of frustration and isolation pouring out. She had worked so hard, had proven herself over and over, and it still wasn't enough. Brennan would file a negative evaluation. Ortega would be pressured to remove her from instruction, and she'd be sent back to intelligence with her tail between her legs. Proof that desk officers should stay behind desks. She thought about quitting. Not just the training program, but the Marines entirely. If the Corps didn't want officers who could bridge the gap between intelligence and combat, who could bring multiple skills to the fight, then maybe she didn't belong here at all. But as the tears subsided, something else took their place. Not anger, not determination, but clarity. She understood now what this fight was really about. The next morning, Claire requested a meeting with Captain Brennan and Staff Sergeant Ortega. They met in Ortega's office, tension thick in the air. "Captain Brennan," Claire began, her voice steady, Yesterday you said these Marines deserve instructors who have been tested in combat. You're right. Brennan nodded, clearly expecting a resignation. But you're wrong about what combat means, Claire continued. You think because I haven't been in a firefight in Helmand Province, I haven't been tested. But I've spent 3 years in forward intelligence positions, analyzing threats while mortar fell on our position. I've coordinated with SEAL teams and Marine raiders, providing real-time intelligence that saved lives. I've been in the room when operators came back shot up, helping debrief them while their wounds were still fresh. That's not the same as pulling a trigger, but it's still combat. It's still war. Lieutenant, Brennan started. I'm not finished, sir. Claire's voice had steel in it now. You oppose my transfer because you believe there's a hierarchy in the military, that intelligence officers are somehow above or separate from the people who do the fighting. But that's exactly the kind of thinking that gets people killed. When intel and operations don't trust each other, when we see ourselves as separate tribes instead of one team, we fail. And Marines die. She turned to include Ortega in her words. I came here because I wanted to understand what the people I'd been supporting actually go through. I wanted to learn their world so I could be better at my job. And maybe, just maybe, I could teach them something about mine. Because the next fight isn't going to be won by the toughest shooters or the smartest analysts. It's going to be won by Marines who can do both. The room was silent. Then Ortega spoke. Captain Brennan, I need to say something. The staff sergeant's voice was rough. When Lieutenant Bennett first arrived, I treated her like you're treating her now. I assumed she couldn't handle this environment. I was wrong. She's one of the best combat instructors I've ever worked with, not despite her intelligence background, but because of it. She sees patterns, reads situations, and teaches these Marines to think while they fight. That's what wins wars, sir. Brennan's face was unreadable. Then he stood. I'll be observing your class this morning, Lieutenant. Teach it like you normally would. I want to see what Ortega is talking about. The class was on adaptive thinking in close quarters combat specifically, how to assess and adjust tactics in real time when the situation changes. Claire had developed it by combining combat techniques with intelligence analysis methods, teaching Marines to read environments and predict enemy behavior. She started with a standard scenario, entering a room with unknown hostiles. But instead of just teaching the physical mechanics, she walked them through the mental process. Before you move, what are you looking for? She asked Martinez. Cover positions, exits, anything that looks out of place. Good. Why does it matter what looks out of place? Because if something's been moved or positioned deliberately, it tells us someone prepared this space. They're thinking ahead. Exactly. You're reading the enemy's mind through their environment. That's intelligence work. Now, Hayes, you're going through that door. The room is set up different from what you expected. What do? Adapt. Don't commit to the plan if the situation's changed. Why not? Hayes paused, thinking. Because the enemy might be adapting too. If I stick to a plan they've already figured out, I'm dead. Claire smiled. That's right. Combat isn't just about being tough or fast. It's about being smarter than the person trying to kill you. Every fight is a conversation. They move, you respond. You move, they respond. The side that reads the conversation better wins. For the next hour, she ran them through scenarios that required both physical skill and mental agility. She made them justify every decision, explain their reasoning, think through consequences. She pushed them hard, but never beyond their capabilities, always building on what they knew. Brennan watched it all in silence. When the class ended, he asked the Marines to share their honest assessment. One by one, they spoke about how Claire's teaching had changed their understanding of combat. Mitchell talked about how analyzing enemy patterns had helped him spot an ambush in a previous exercise. Martinez described using environmental reading to predict where hostile instructors would position themselves. Hayes, looking uncomfortable but sincere, admitted that he had initially dismissed Claire's approach as overthinking, but now recognized it as an edge that might save his life downrange. After they were dismissed, Brennan turned to Claire. His expression had changed, not warm, but no longer hostile. "I was wrong about you, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "I thought you were running away from intelligence because you didn't have the stomach for the real work. But you're not running from anything. You're running towards something bigger. You're trying to build a bridge between worlds that should never have been separated in the first place." He extended his hand. "I'm going to recommend that your assignment here be made permanent. The Corps needs officers like you, people who refuse to be put in boxes, who see the whole picture." "I'm sorry I tried to stop that." Claire shook his hand, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. But more important than Brennan's approval was what happened over the next few weeks. The Marines she trained started performing better in every metric. Their tactical thinking improved. Their adaptability increased, and most importantly, they gained confidence not just in their physical abilities, but in their mental capabilities. 3 months later, that same group deployed to Afghanistan. Claire stayed at Camp Pendleton, training new Marines with the methods she'd developed. She heard from them occasionally, messages sent through official channels or passed along by other Marines rotating back. The most meaningful came from Corporal Hayes. 8 months into his deployment. "Lieutenant, we hit an ambush yesterday. Complex attack, well planned." But Mitchell spotted the pattern, saw how they'd positioned themselves, and figured out their plan before they could execute. "We turned it around on them, used their own setup against them. No casualties on our side. Thought you should know those lessons you taught about reading the environment? They saved our lives. Thank you for not giving up on us, even when we didn't deserve your patience." Claire kept that message in her desk drawer. On difficult days, when new Marines arrived skeptical or dismissive, when other instructors questioned her methods, when the weight of proving herself over and over again felt overwhelming, she would read it and remember why she was here. She had come to Camp Pendleton as an outsider, laughed at and dismissed. She had faced mockery, resentment, and opposition from people who should have been her allies. She had been tested, broken down, and forced to question everything about herself and her purpose. But she had also discovered something profound. The true strength isn't about being the toughest person in the room. It's about refusing to accept limitations others place on you. It's about building bridges where others see only walls. It's about transforming skeptics into believers, not through force, but through patience, skill, an unwavering belief in what you have to offer. Years later, when Claire made captain and then major, when her training methods became standard across the Marine Corps, when young officers sought her out as a mentor and role model, people would ask her about that day on the training mat, the day she dropped 4 Marines in seconds and changed everything. But that wasn't the day that mattered most to her. The day that mattered was the one that came after, when she chose to stay despite the resentment, to teach despite the skepticism, to build despite the opposition. That was the day she truly became what she'd always been meant to be. Not just a warrior, not just an analyst, but a leader who showed others that they could be more than the limits others set for them. In the end, they hadn't just laughed at her during training. They had doubted her, dismissed her, tried to break her spirit and send her back to where she belonged. But Claire Bennett had proved that belonging isn't given, it's earned through sweat, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief that you have something valuable to contribute. And sometimes, just sometimes, earning that belonging means dropping 4 Marines in seconds, not to humiliate them, but to show them that strength comes in forms they never expected, from places they never thought to look, and that the greatest warriors are the ones who can fight with both their bodies and their minds. The sun still rises over Camp Pendleton every morning, casting the same long shadows across the training grounds. But the Marines who train there now do so with a broader understanding of what it means to be strong, to be smart, to be ready for whatever comes. And somewhere in that legacy, in every Marine who learned to think while they fight, is the echo of a lieutenant who refused to accept no for an answer, who turned mockery into respect, and who proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a fist. It's the courage to be exactly who you are, even when everyone says you should be someone else.